Welcome to the MentorCore event that we have today. I am thrilled that we have Giannis and Goldson here today with us. My name is Lisa Beth Lentini Walker. I run a compliance, ethics, and corporate governance consulting firm called Lumen Worldwide Endeavors, and I'm one of the co-founders of MentorCore. MentorCore is a community for compliance, security, and risk professionals. We want to create an environment where people can grow and develop and find out about why people are attracted to the profession, how we can retain people in the profession, how we can make it a more inclusive and exciting place to be. My co-founder, Dan.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're really glad to have you. My name is Daniel Ayala. I have a security and privacy consultancy called Socratic that brings virtual CISO, virtual privacy officer into small and medium businesses. But I think the best part of what I do is getting to work with people and getting to help grow and grow organizations in their security and privacy posture, but also help to grow people within those organizations, which is why MentorCore is such an important part of my life. And I'm really excited to be here. Really great to see you again, Lisa Beth, and really glad to have you here, Rabbi.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So for anyone who doesn't know, Rabbi Goldson is here to talk with us about his journey. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that he has written a book that's become quite popular called Grappling with the Gray. But I'm not the best person to talk about you. Rabbi, can you tell us about you a little bit? Because I know that everybody's very interested.
Well, if you do enough of these interviews, you get really tired of talking about yourself, but I'll give it a shot. I graduated from the University of California with a degree in English, and I put my degree to good use by going hitchhiking cross country for half a year, across the Atlantic, went backpacking across Europe until I ended up in Israel, and that's where I connected with my Jewish roots. Been raised with really no knowledge at all of what it meant to be Jewish. And I discovered, much to my surprise, a vibrant culture full of profound thoughts and intellectual and moral discipline. It changed the whole trajectory of my life. I ended up staying in Israel for 9 years, met my wife there. We had our first two children there, became an Orthodox rabbi, and then set out on my career teaching high school. I wanted to impart to Jewish teenagers the lessons and the insights that I had acquired. And in 2016, after 23 years, I retired from teaching. And that's when I started my business as a professional speaker. I wanted to take all of the wisdom that I'd been studying and teaching for so many years and distill it into a presentation that would be relevant to a professional audience. And so I came up with ethical leadership and intellectual integrity, understanding how good ethics is good business and why a culture of ethics is the key and the secret for success. The hard part for me was actually becoming a businessman, which I had never done and never thought I would do and never wanted to do. That was a pretty steep learning curve. And just as everything was coming together, 2020 was going to be my year.
I think it was going to be mine too. So, like,
Yeah,
we have that in common for sure.
easy to say now, of course, but the whole conference industry is shut down, and now let's start over again. But it has given me the opportunity to produce a lot of content online, articles, videos, interviews, because I have really come, the more I discuss this, the more passionate I become that ethics is the key to all our relationships. And relationship really is the key to success in our personal life, in our business world, and in our communities. And then when those relationships break down, as certainly we see it happening in the political world, way past breaking down. Um, but families are threatened by it, and it's a challenge to business when we have integrity, when we have trust, when we have loyalty. Then that's what generates passion, and that's what drives productivity. And so I bristle at the term soft skills, um, because those soft skills are really what everyday interactions are all about. And if we get those right, then the hard skills will probably fall into place and then do what they're supposed to do.
Is there a more descriptive term or a better, more applicable term to use than soft skills that you found?
I suppose interpersonal skills. I don't have a problem with that. It's just that term soft makes it sound, well, they're not that important.
That it's lesser, yeah.
All right, well, we'll do the important stuff first, which of course means we'll never get to the other stuff. And it's really backwards.
Yeah, it's interesting because um, for whatever reason, I think culturally we have been trained that hard is good and soft is not. And there's a value judgment on something being like a hard skill or a hard topic to master being something that is somehow more desirable. And
Yeah, and
yet,
that
yeah.
yeah, well, that's why my TED talk is called The Art of Ethical Communication,
Mhm.
because the words we choose have implicit meanings. And we talk about things like unconscious bias. It's not just about race, it's not just about identity. It really is about everything. And the choice of words and when language comes to connote a certain meaning, whether it should or not, then we have to accommodate that. We have to account for that. And we have to recognize when we're actually feeding on certain unconscious biases through the choice of the words that we use.
And the fact that so much has been pinned lately, especially in the security and compliance and ethics fields, around the lack of good communication or ability to effectively communicate, these soft interpersonal skills, as being the reason that we're not finding the success by and large within larger business context, is because a lack of them. It actually paints this as a even more important topic than the technical pieces.
Yeah, and I think I'll probably upset a few people with this, but I'm personally uncomfortable with this new term, microaggression. We used to just call it bad manners. Sort of now you're elevating it to a level where it's some kind of a monster. It's some phenomenon that we have to grapple with. It really just comes down to sensitivity, and sensitivity works both ways. I need to be sensitive for how I speak, and I also have to be sensitive that other people may not have the same calibration that I do. And if somebody's saying something that's really offensive, okay, that needs to be addressed. But if someone may be maybe a little clueless, maybe a little unaware, or maybe just not quite on the same wavelength, that doesn't mean that they intend to do harm. It doesn't mean that they intend to cause offense. It could be that we can educate them, or it could be sometimes you just let things go because it's not such a big deal.
Hmm. So you talked about your journey from having to learn the side of the business after having gone through your career and retired from teaching students. How did you learn about the business, and what key takeaways would you give to other people?
Um, Mentorship is really the key, and that can be a little bit intimidating. I didn't have a formal mentor who took me under his wing and walked me through things. But what I did is I started asking around, talk to people. How does a speaking business work? And what I kept hearing again and again was join the National Speakers Association.
A
And
common refrain.
after hearing that enough, I said, okay, this sounds like like the way to go. And I was absolutely overwhelmed by the culture of giving and support. I mean, I called up people out of the blue that I later found out were enormously successful. And they spent an hour with me on the phone. Some of them did actually mentor me in a more informal sense. But just the culture of generosity and giving and mutual support. We're all in this together. We have an expression that we use in the association. We're not fighting over pieces of the pie. We're trying to bake a bigger pie.
Mhm.
And
Like
people
that.
give away their intellectual property. You got to go to a convention. Okay, conventions are not cheap. You know, you got to pay the registration. You got to pay the travel. You got to pay the hotel. It's a big expense, but the wealth of wisdom that's available and the camaraderie, meeting. I've met people that have become very, very close friends. I'm collaborating with some of them now. Uh, it's if you find, and it's whatever. I mean, I don't know. There are countless organizations, associations in this country alone and around the world, and to find the association that fits with your business plan, your business model, your vision of where you want to be. And a lot of people belong to more than one association. There are local ones, there are national ones, there are local chapters of national ones, but it's those relationships. And it goes back to the whole discussion we had at the beginning. It's relationships. I'm committed to people because we're committed to each other, because we have a common vision, because we want to support each other. Those relationships are going to serve me in anything that I want to do.
Yeah. So we got our first question in the chat that I'd like to pose to you. Have you noticed an elevation in lack of civility in impersonal communications given the tech challenges of all the virtual meeting environments compounded by the stress of working solely from home amid distraction and even the divisive political climate of the past few years? And are there ways that you see to help foster enhanced communication and those quote unquote soft skills given this current environment? I mean,
That's
that's
a
a lot
really
to unpackage. It's a good question.
that's a really interesting question, and there are a lot of pieces to it. I don't know how much we should go into the political angle, but I think we can all agree that politics has become much less civil, and that
Yeah,
has
so
an effect.
it's almost like a blood sport at this point in
Yeah,
time.
well, and that's part of the problem. We are really living in the Roman Empire,
Yeah.
in the sense that it's all about bread and circuses. The Romans invented the entertainment industry, and they invented the entitlement culture.
Hmm.
Let's keep our people distracted and let's give them the basic needs, and they'll leave us alone to do what we want. And it's even worse to some point now, because audiences are a commodity. Audiences are biggest business. I mean, we are being bought and sold through social media, through cable, through television, through movies, through sports, even through politics. We are the product. Human beings are the product. Eyeballs are the product.
Right.
And what grabs eyeballs is extreme images, violence, scandal, chaos, spectacle. And so that really does have a corrosive effect on our civility. You remember when there were words you couldn't hear on television, right? George Carlin had a whole routine about that.
It was quite a good routine.
He was brilliant. But George Carlin was funnier when he was clean. You watch the stuff he did for television when he couldn't swear. He was much funnier because he had to get the laughs without the cheap, dirty words. Um, there's a question that I saw. Questions children ask. So, child asks his father, "If we're not allowed to use swear words, why were they invented?"
Good question.
That's not what we've had at my dinner table lately.
Well, yeah, but I actually I did a video on this, that it's worth having words that we can't use to remind us that we need to be careful about what we say. It's just a discipline to be disciplined in how we speak. Yeah, there are lots of different ways you can communicate the same idea. So why not communicate it in a way that's refined, that's respectful, that's civil? Now, that was really a side point to the question. One of the issues that I see on Zoom calls or these types of virtual calls is if you have a gallery view, lots of people on there. Very often people forget that they can be seen.
Mhm.
And if I'm talking and there's somebody who's eating lunch or typing with his eyes elsewhere, or on the phone, or not there at all,
Right. Here we go.
because he got up and walked away. As a speaker, it's a little unsettling. When you speak to a live audience, there is a certain decorum. People may be on their phones, but they're doing a little bit,
Quasi paying
A
attention.
little bit of
yeah,
active
they're
listening.
trying to hold onto the table. They don't want to be too obvious about it. They're not actually going to be talking on the phone. They're going to be texting or scrolling.
Right.
But there's a sense that they're responsible. People forget that when they're sitting in front of the computer. Then if you go to the other extreme, okay, so I'll be polite. I need to eat my lunch because I haven't a break all day, or I need to take this call because it's important. Right? So I will
Turn off the camera.
disappear.
Right.
Okay. The problem is now I have a whole bunch of pictures or names staring at me. And I feel like I'm talking to a blank screen.
Mhm.
Right? So Zoom etiquette is really something that we should remind ourselves of. If you have to do something that you shouldn't be on screen, okay, and stop your video. But if you don't, just to honor the speaker, to honor the other people in the meeting, to have your camera on, to be present. And I know if you're spending all day on the computer, it can get a little wearying. But that's part of the price of doing business, in the sense that that's how we show respect to other people. So on the one hand, Zoom has made it easy to meet with lots of different people. Travel times cut way down.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
We can talk to lots of people at once who are in different places. There's a lot to be grateful for. You're talking, complain about Zoom fatigue. Imagine what it would be like during COVID if we didn't have this, and to appreciate how much better our lives are because we have this kind of technology. But it's always a question of, don't take things for granted. Don't take people for granted. Remember that, yeah, I have the right to act any way I want, but I have a responsibility to you, to honor you and to show respect for you. And if we can keep that present of mind, um, it's going to make things a lot easier for all of us.
As that line, as the line, in the privacy world, we talk about the creepy line, the fact that what you can come up to without having people recoil at the action. And the same thing when you talk about George Carlin's 7 words you can't say on TV. Those, we've
like
blown
this?
right past that line. Yeah, we've blown right past those lines, and the lines continue to move as society moves with them. But along with that comes the ethical behavior that goes along with it, the commitment to attentiveness and the social norms that were there. And I guess, how do we bring some of those back? Through example, of course, is the way, the one way we have control. I just worry that bringing that line backward is, there's so many forces going the other direction. You then become an outlier when you're the one trying to maintain the more ethical norms, the more attentive norms.
Yeah, that's really insightful, and it's a tremendous challenge, because it's always hard to move the line back.
Mm-hmm.
The line is always going to be shifting. One of the stories I found fascinating is that in the Civil War, women were not allowed to approach the camp with food or supplies, because sometimes when the men came out of their tents, they hadn't put on their waistcoats yet, their vests, and
Scandalous.
it was inappropriate for a woman to see a man not wearing a waistcoat. Why did that change? Because by the end of the war, the waistcoats had worn out, and the soldiers couldn't get new ones, couldn't afford new ones. And so the standards had to change to fit the reality. John F. Kennedy was the first president to be inaugurated without a hat on.
Mm-hmm.
And hats went out of style almost overnight.
Mhm.
trends always incline to the lowest common denominator.
Right.
I know for myself, I was raised that you use first names with your friends and people you haven't met yet and business associates. You call them by the last name.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that just doesn't seem to work anymore. It's
No.
stuffy, it's stilted. The whole world's on a first name basis. I don't really like it, but I do it because that's become the norm and it feels more artificial to hang on to that. So I really do sympathize with your question, Dan. Um, it's a question of for us to sort of feel where is our comfort level, or maybe better, where should our comfort level be, is to hold on to certain prerogatives. I get comments periodically. I come on Zoom and say, "Oh, a tie! You're wearing a tie."
Good.
Well, that's part of my brand,
Yep.
and I preserve that. But also, I get up early every morning. I get dressed. I put on a tie because it helps me get in business mode,
Mm-hmm.
and as opposed to pajama mode. Now, could be some people are working better in their pajamas. We've all heard the stories about the people who stood up when they shouldn't have. And,
Don't stand up, Dan.
I won't stand up. But it's funny you say that. Just 3 days ago, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. We both came up through banking and consulting together, suits and ties, and I really enjoy suits and ties. But I went from banking to another industry, and within a few weeks was asked, "Please, Daniel, don't wear a suit and tie to the office anymore. It wasn't as formal of a culture. It's making people uncomfortable." And so you start to adjust, and that becomes the norm. And but I bring it back to, these are things that define respect. They define ethics. These are all tied toward more stringent norms that make it more difficult as a society to automatically think about things that are respectful, using last names, things that are ethical, things that are less, that are further from, your very accurate description of the Roman Empire culture of of indulgence uh, and lack of those features. I struggle with how to. It's something I actively struggle with, and we talk about a lot.
Mhm.
you've really said the answer. The answer is to struggle with it. One of my favorite sound bites is, "There's no app for being ethical."
That's a
I
quotable
bet I could
moment.
raise 20 million tomorrow if I did have one, though.
Well, yeah.
You could probably you would be the next $1 billion
There
baby
you
at that
go.
point.
The truth is, you don't even need to have one. You just have to convince people you have one.
And put blockchain in it.
Oh, just went up to $2 billion.
But the point is that ethical principles may not change, but I don't like the term situational ethics because that has a whole connotation that is really not true. Ethics don't change, but situations do change. And being able to read the situation and respond is really what ethics is all about. That's why I call my book Grappling with the Gray, because we're grappling with gray areas. If it's black or white, you don't need ethics.
Right.
But the gray areas, choosing between right or wrong and wrong, or prioritizing, and you have your priorities, I have mine, doesn't mean one of us is right and one of us is wrong. But we still have to live together, work together, interact with each other. And being sensitive to others' priorities is really what ethics is all about. It's just recognizing and taking responsibility for the impact my actions have on you. And it's also grappling with the gray matter. We have to think about these things. We have to train ourselves to be mindful, to be thoughtful, to be aware. That's how civil society functions. And does it really matter if the salad fork's on the inside or the outside?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
The fork doesn't care.
A fork doesn't care, but
Your
I
salad's
do.
not going to taste any different if you put it on the other side, right? But it's a way of reminding ourselves that there's something called table manners. There's etiquette. Well, here's another one. Etiquette is the art of social ethics.
Mm-hmm.
The
No, that's
way
a
we
great
treat people reminds us that it's important how we treat people. And the more conscious we are of that, the more it will filter into all of our human relations.
Yeah, that's terrific. And on a slightly different note, I did want to say you have a YouTube channel. And I have been watching your YouTubes. I've been sharing them with my children, the ones that are old enough to understand them. Um, but tell me what inspired you to do this, how you get your inspiration for those episodes. Everybody who's on the call should be following you. I'm a subscriber. Um, Tell me more about what made you go in that direction.
So there's a rabbi in the 1800s, Rabbi Jacob, and he was famous for his parables. He had a parable for everything. And so, predictably, somebody asked him, "How do you come up with all these great parables?" And predictably, he answered, "I'll tell you a parable." So he told the following story. A fellow's walking through the woods, and he sees um, a bullseye painted onto a tree with an arrow in the exact center. Perfect bullseye. And he walks, he sees another tree, another bullseye, another arrow in the exact center. And more of these as he goes along. He says, "What an extraordinary marksman this must be. He never misses." And then he hears the sound of a bow, a thunk of an arrow, and he comes into a clearing, and there's the marksman, the bowsman, and he's just shot another perfect bullseye. He says, "How do you do it? How do you never miss?" He says, "It's very simple. First, I shoot the arrow at the tree, and then I paint the bullseye around it." So Rabbi Jacob said, when most people want a parable, they have a lesson to teach. And so they go looking for a parable that fits the lesson. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. He said, what I do is I go through life, I observe. And whatever I see, I ask myself, what's the lesson I can learn from what I've just observed? And then I file that away. When I want to teach that lesson, now I have what I observed as the parable for it. And this story has had a huge impact on me, because what I try to do now is I want to teach ethics. Well, there's plenty to talk about in the news, in the headlines. And so what I do is I'll scroll through the headlines and I'll look for a story that has a clear ethical message, at least clear to me. Better if it's not as clear to others. And what I try to do is not so much assert my vision of what's the ethical solution, although sometimes I do that, but more important, I try to frame the question. Because what I want people to do is to look at situations from both sides. Again, that's what my whole book is about, is posing ethical dilemmas, ethical scenarios, and then giving people an opportunity. Okay, defend this side, defend that side. Because it's only when we understand both sides that we understand either side. If I don't understand where you're coming from, how can I possibly be sure you're wrong? And if I don't understand why you disagree with me, how can I be sure I'm right? So we have to make that effort if we want to have intellectual integrity, if we want to find the balance between all these different possible responses and create a mindset that leads to ethical behavior. This is the formula for approaching difficult questions, using the gray matter and grappling with that.
But that requires an engaged community, a fully engaged community, to truly be realized. While the practitioners that are thinking about having ethical conversations is one thing, is it enough without the broad, without the broad community being part of the same discussion? Is ethics good enough to be done in a small, in a microcosm?
If you would like me to, if you'd like to bring me in to talk to 5,000 people,
You're
or
happy
talk
to do so.
or talk to CEOs, I'm happy to do that. But I think that really the approach we need to take, and this comes from Jewish philosophy. We have a concept that's called tikkun olam. It translates as repair the world, and most people who use it don't really understand it, because repair the world, right? What did George Carlin say? Save the trees, save the bees, save the whales, save the snails. Uh, that's not what it means. I am the world I need to repair, because ultimately I'm the only world I have control over. Now, maybe the way to do that is by campaigning to save the whales and save the trees, but really the only thing I control is myself. And so to start small, start with your family, start with your best friends, start with your community, start with your in your business if you can. But create small enclaves where people have the mindset, we're committed to doing better. We're committed to asking more from ourselves. And we're not going to be pointing the finger, oh, you've made an ethical violation there. We're going to be looking at ourselves, asking, how can I do better? Asking you, can you please let me know if you're okay with this, if I'm approaching this question okay, and not get upset with people. I mean, there's so much of a movement today to look for reason to be offended, to look for reason to assume the worst about other people, to have all these labels that we use for this violation and that violation. What if we first work about ourselves? Because we tend to be much more forgiving with ourselves than we are with others, and it should be exactly the opposite. We should look for ways to forgive others when we can, and hold ourselves to a higher account. Imagine how much more pleasant society would be if we would all take that approach.
It's interesting. So I really find this concept of framing things up and having people think about multiple sides. It's something that we did in law school, right? You had to know how to argue both
Yeah,
sides because you'd had to see what the weaknesses in your argument were.
right.
But it is not something that is encouraged very much right now, and I am concerned in some ways that it's because the lazy answer of "I'm right, you're wrong" is much easier than saying I'm going to think really critically and say, no answer is necessarily perfect. So I need to understand what's going on in the broader world. I think in ethics in particular, but also in other professions like compliance, like privacy, cybersecurity, even to some extent, we have opportunities to educate and model. And one of the things that we can model is taking an approach that understands that there's more than one vantage point.
Yes, and this is also something that's very much uh, rooted in Jewish philosophy. That I always think of it this way: if you think of a car ad in a magazine,
Mm-hmm.
how much of the car are you actually seeing?
Not a lot.
You're seeing one angle,
One angle.
right? Sometimes if they have enough room, they'll show you different shots. And they'll show you the interior, they'll show you under the hood, they'll show you the chassis, they'll show you the trunk. Well, which of those pictures is the real car? They all are, but they're all incomplete. Doesn't mean that one's right and one's wrong. In advertising, you want to show the angle that makes the car most attractive to your prospective buyer. When we look at things, we choose the angle that's most attractive to us because of our politics, our personalities, our expectations, our desires. But it doesn't mean that somebody who's looking from a different angle is wrong. And if we actually make the effort to understand, let me look at it from your angle. I actually just posted an article about this yesterday, and someone called me on it and asked me that am I doing what I asked everybody else to do? Um, I posed a question that relates to politics today, and then I said, write a short essay, either defending or arguing with a statement. But the condition is, if you agree with the statement, you have to write an article arguing with it. And if you disagree with it, you have to write an article agreeing with it. And as you said, Lisa, about, that's basic training in law school. If you're not prepared for the other side's argument, you're not going to be effective making your own. And why don't we apply that same principle to other aspects of our lives? And to find out what other people are thinking and why they're thinking that way before we become convinced that we have the corner on truth.
Mm-hmm. The I think one of the challenges is that people like certainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. If you can't be comfortable that you're always right, then you're always a little uncomfortable.
And the
Which,
irony is that all the gurus tell us we have to get out of our comfort zones.
right, but nobody really wants to be out of their comfort zone. They want to
Why
feel like
not?
they did that,
Because
but
it's
it's not
uncomfortable.
right. So we have another amazing question. Um, so this one is a little bit more focused on where we're at as a country right now. As a country, we in the United States seem to be stuck in a very polarized conversation about how to live the values on which our Constitution was grounded, but we can't even seem to agree on what unity means in the United States. So if you could choose one value around which we could begin a new conversation that gives us some tiny point upon which we could potentially agree, what would that be? Would it be something like dignity or decency? Where would you put this conversation?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of terms that are all sort of clustered around the same idea. And dignity and decency, I certainly like. Um, the one I often choose is civility. And there's a wonderful book by Stephen O. Carter called Civility,
Very original.
and another one called Integrity, and they're both worth reading. But in civility, he points out that civility is the linguistic root of civilization. And that I really applaud the author of that question, that we have to recognize that what we're doing now is not sustainable. It is interesting. I recently finished George Washington's biography, and it was surprising to me that what he was describing going on between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton didn't sound that different from the type of stuff that's going on now. That's just they didn't have as much technology to raise the volume so high. But at the same time, these are people who worked together when they had to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's missing. There is this combative atmosphere in Congress. Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman from Hawaii, who just stepped down, she was describing her experience coming into Congress as freshman congresswoman. And there's this big get together where they're all friends and everybody's happy and they're all getting along. And then they separate into their parties. And they're told if the other party sponsors a bill, don't vote for it. But if a year or two later, our party sponsors a similar bill, then you can vote for it. I mean, this is not leadership. This is not government. And this is not, again, it's not sustainable. So I guess I would default to civility, but there are so many good answers to that question. um, because a lot of it comes down to trust.
Right.
Right now, we just don't trust each other.
And without that, I don't know that you can have relationships that go very far.
No, you can't. So all of these, the decency, the integrity, the dignity, the civility, those are all factors in restoring and reclaiming trust. And that has to be the goal right now. The question is, where's it going to come from? We're just not getting it from the people in office.
So there was another question that came in. Did you want to ask it, Dan?
No, no, good.
And it says, one of the things that you're saying is that you have to be prepared to argue the other point side. Aren't there some basic principles that are not subject to argumentation? And I mean, it's a question, right? And so we'd love to hear your perspective.
There certainly are. If somebody comes in advocating for murder, I think we have a problem.
Yes, we have a problem because as a society, we've decided that's not okay.
Well, there seems to be a sort of universality about that one. Stealing, but there's so many nuances. The sixth commandment is frequently misquoted as "Thou shalt not kill." That's not what it says in the Hebrew. It's "Thou shalt not murder." Well, what's the difference between murdering and killing? Murdering is illegal killing. When is killing legal? Well, self-defense, warfare, capital punishment, because we're not on the same page about all these either. Right? So sometimes we do have to discuss our core values to remember why there are core values. Mm-hmm. Because nowadays there's just so much moral relativism that it's hard to get people together on almost anything. And that's part of the reason for the tribalism that we see and the groupthink that we see. Well, that person is so far away from me, it's not even worth the effort trying to bridge the gap. So I'm going to simply associate with people who think like me because I'm not going to get anywhere with those other people. And statistically, this is a perception that is the perception is much worse than the reality. I mean, I don't have the statistics with me, but I saw them recently. And, Republicans mistrust Democrats and Democrats mistrust Republicans by a factor of 3 more than they should. Because there is this perception that we're all polarized, we're all militant, and there's just nowhere to go and no one to talk to. If we take the conversation to a business setting, think about if everybody comes into a meeting absolutely convinced that their way is the right way to approach this particular problem.
We've all met somebody like that.
Sure,
just FYI. We've all met somebody like that.
Maybe recently. But how productive are those conversations?
They're not. They're just not.
So if it's really, let the other person speak first. Oh, well, somebody has to speak first. Well, that should be our biggest problem. I want you to speak first. You want me to speak first. That one we'll get through.
Right. Right. Very good point. Dan, what were you going to say?
It feels like, though, there is also an increased willingness to put aside actual belief in return for polarized beliefs, because in order to further your own cause, not necessarily because you believe it. And this comes back to some of the indulgence or the lack of boundaries that society has taken on. I don't intend to turn this into a trial on society in general, but I guess, to what extent have you encountered that in your studies as well, that people act the part but not necessarily believe the part?
Or I take it even further. They believe something that isn't true. I actually have a discussion about this in my book that I think his name is Michael Schellenberger. He is one of the prominent figures in addressing climate change. And he says that those zealots who misrepresent the facts about global warming do far more damage to the cause than those who deny climate change altogether.
Mm.
Because if I present a perspective that is not sound, if I publish a paper, if I cite facts, I guess factoids is a better, more accurate term, what purport to be facts that are in fact not factual, then what I've really done is I've discredited my
Hmm.
entire movement. Everybody who believes in my side is now suspect to being part of this conspiracy to disseminate false information. So if I don't know something's true, I have an ethical responsibility to say I don't know.
Hmm.
Maybe I have an ethical responsibility to go find out. But if I'm going to cite facts, if I don't, okay, I read it. I read it online. Right?
And
Remember
everything
what
online
Abraham
is
Lincoln
true.
said? Don't believe everything you read in the internet.
Right.
If if I'm not careful about the information, I've done this. I've written articles citing other articles I saw that turned out to be inaccurate because I didn't
Hmm.
look to see where they got their information from. And that's a failure on my part. I'm much more careful now. But even then, there's so much misinformation, and once it's out there, it gets repeated again and again and again. And I've seen some really prominent people cite facts that everyone knows that aren't true.
Right.
And the extreme availability of things means you end up getting circular references back to, and and which legitimizes a false source as
Right.
well.
Yeah. There used to be a little more rigor around data and publication.
Hmm.
Now it's so easy to publish, and it's um, the medium that we have right now is powerful, but amplifies both good and bad.
Well said.
Hmm.
So
Wikipedia is a great resource, but don't take everything on there as gospel.
no, because you know what? We could go in and change it right now. Which is both good and bad, right? Eventually,
Oh,
maybe we'll
scary,
get
yeah.
to something that kind of resembles reality. But the crowdsourcing of wisdom is, I think, a challenge, and it actually creates some challenges from an ethics standpoint as well.
Well, it also sets the culture. It also sets the mindset that this is truth. And the people coming out of school now, people coming out, don't understand about back to the question about basic fundamentals about legitimate primary sources. I have a family. My wife's a librarian, and I've spent time in research organizations. Things that relate to what can be agreed on as truth isn't something that everybody can agree to anymore.
Yeah, well, that's what they call postmodernism, right? Where relative facts, and it's really, I mean, it is Orwellian. I mean, the more time passes, the more prophetic George Orwell becomes. There's a British comedian. His name is Andrew Doyle, I think. He created a a fictional character. I think she's called Tashiana McGrath, I think, and she's a stereotypic character. And so he writes articles, satirical editorials under her name. And so he wrote one saying that we need to ban Mary Poppins because in the chimney sweep scene, she appears in blackface. Of course, it's a chimney sweep scene. They're all covered with soot.
They're
And
all
then,
covered. Yeah.
right? So he wrote this as a statistic. He said 6 months later, he read an article in the New York Times making the case. He says, you can't invent things that are so wacky that somebody won't actually take it seriously.
When the
Uh,
onion is a primary source, you've got a problem.
yeah, so
Right.
it's the facts, it's the logic, it's the sense of balance. And we can say it's a lost cause because it certainly feels like that at times.
Sometimes.
But in our own little communities, I love the I don't know where this comes from, but the old man who's reflecting on his life. He says, "When I was young, I wanted to change the world, and I realized I wasn't going to change the world. So I tried to change my country, and I realized I couldn't change my country. So I tried to change my community, and I couldn't change my community. So I tried to change my family, and I couldn't change my family either. So in the end, I changed myself. And what I like to add to that is, by changing myself, I changed the world." Again,
Back to Tikkun
we only have
Olam.
control over ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a little bit more tactical question. Do you think that the ethics role should be separate from the compliance role within companies?
Ah,
We
Rabbi,
are talking about compliance and ethics and not letting them be enemies.
yes.
Can they
Well,
coexist?
it's interesting you say that. I used to say that compliance can be the enemy of ethics, and I was on another podcast with Diane Helbig, and she actually prompted me to put it into the positive that ethics begins where compliance ends, because you need structure, you need regulations, you need rules. The problem with compliance is when it attempts to legislate ethics. Because as we've already talked about, ethics is a mindset. There's no app for it. You're going to have to reevaluate and calibrate for every new situation. And that's what keeps us ethical, is recognizing that we have that responsibility to grapple with those gray areas.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to try to come up with a code of compliance that's going to cover every possible contingency, first, it won't work. And second, it's missing the point. The point of compliance is to create the skeleton on which you can hang the flesh and sinew of an ethical mindset and ethical culture. So they should work hand in hand. If they don't, it's because we're conflating the two.
Mhm.
Very
Interesting.
interesting. Very interesting. Well, Rabbi, we're unfortunately getting close to the end of the hour. It went so fast. But we do at the end of every one of our events, we like to ask, because we're focused so heavily on mentoring, we really want to get an idea from the people who join us how mentors have played into your life. So I'm curious, what's the best thing you've ever learned from a mentor? The
Gosh,
informal
one
ones, and it sounds
thing.
like, I think you have more formal mentors than you may admit to. But from one of those mentors, what's the best thing you've learned?
Um,
Most valuable thing?
well, it's I'm not sure if this quite answers the question, but it is quite relevant to this discussion. When I started thinking about having a speaking business, and I spoke to a very successful speaker and speaker coach here in St. Louis, Lois Kramer, and she said, "What do you speak about?" And I gave the classic answer of so many rookie speakers: "I talk about everything." And she said, "No, you don't." So I started rattling off a number of topics I talk about. And she picked out two and suggested I focus there. And one of those was ethics. And so the general advice was, and this has become a bit of a cliche, but it's still true, is pick a lane. Don't try to be everything to everybody. Have a clear message, a clear focus, a clear purpose. But for me, beyond that was realizing that ethics made so much sense for me. Because as I like to call myself the speaker with 3,000 years experience, uh, I'm bringing all of this wisdom that I've taught and studied for decades and trying to condense it into a soundbite. And nothing fits better than ethics.
Mhm.
the mindfulness of how my actions affect you, the responsibility for how my behavior affects those around me. Um, that's what ethics is all about. And so a mentor doesn't necessarily teach us something that we don't know. A mentor helps us discover how we can bring to the table our greatest strengths and our greatest assets.
Very well said. Very well said. And with that, Rabbi, thank you so much for today. Really appreciate these insights. This has been a magnificent set of discussions across both practical portions of the field of ethics and compliance, as well as loftier discussion around culture and society and ethics and its role in it. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here, and thank you so much to everybody for joining today.
Yeah, I know that a number of our listeners have already ordered your book,
Well,
Grappling with the Gray, and we appreciate you so much for bringing your perspectives and helping us have these conversations at MentorCore.
No, it's been delightful, and really encourage the audience to feel free to reach out either through my website or through LinkedIn. I'm always happy to continue the discussion.